Good morning, everyone. Sorry for keeping you. I just came from a wonderful session with our former President, Mary Robinson, which was the most inspirational thing I've heard in some time, and 600 people showed up. And here's another stalwart 150 of you, the intelligent audiences of Galway, who are always a great delight to meet again. So welcome to First Thought. This is our first day of this strand of the festival, which is to do with talks, lectures, debates, but we tend to focus on enlightenment rather than debate, on light rather than heat. We want to inform people. We know that our audiences here are interested in learning things rather than making speeches about themselves, which can happen at some events. And that for that, to please you, we have gathered a wonderful program of people over these 2 weekends. And take a look at the second weekend as well. Those of you who haven't looked at it, there's some wonderful stuff coming up then. So, Donald Trump has created an increasingly dark and chilling atmosphere for immigrants in the US, even those like Ilhan Omar, who've been American citizens for many years. And the southern border has become a flashpoint for desperate people seeking escape from countries plagued with violence, some of whom have died in their attempt to reach safety. All of you will remember that terrible photograph of Oscar Martinez and his daughter Valeria, who died crossing the Rio Grande. All too common an event, unfortunately. This morning, we have one of our best known and best loved journalists, Marion McKeone, who writes for the Sunday Business Post, writes from America, and often pops up on the radio on a Sunday talking to Marion Finucane. She must be in the middle of the night in Los Angeles or wherever, but she sounds as fresh as a daisy, full of razor-sharp insights. And also, she's funny, which is a really great thing to have. So she's going to talk to us today about Mr. Trump and his wall and the various other aspects of borders and obstacles and barriers that he is creating. And we're very delighted to have Larry Donnelly, who's going to interview her here this morning. He's a native of Boston, of the USA himself, and he holds both American and Irish passports. So if he wants to get rid of one of those, we can imagine what that one might be at the moment. However, there is hope. He's a lecturer in Hope at NUIG, and he's the founder and director of the School of Law's highly regarded clinical legal education program. He's an attorney. I always think people who lecture in law who are practicing as well are always better because they know what it's like on the coalface. He's got substantial experience of practice in the US. He was active in politics and government there, and now he contributes regularly to various media outlets on politics, current affairs, and law in the United States and in Ireland. So you will have heard him very often on the Sean Moncrief Show and other broadcast outlets saying highly intelligent things about both America and Ireland. Centrally involved with one of the great civic society organisations here in Ireland, the Free Legal Aid Centres, which is the legal profession giving something back. You might say as well some of them might, with their tribunal millions and their fabulous houses in Rathgar. Anyway, we won't go there. Plenty of lawyers aren't rich. But the Free Legal Advice Centres are a wonderful opportunity for people, for lawyers to give something back to the profession that can be too expensive to access for many of us. And later today, we're going to have a session on transgender, which is an issue that is confusing a lot of people, I think, in the country, including myself. I want to be educated myself about what it's like to be transgender. We will have a number of transgender people speaking for themselves, telling us what it's like, what challenges they face. But we will also have Lydia Foy, who is the first person to seek the right and to get the right to change her birth certificate to the gender of her choice. And that was done by FLAC, by the Free Legal Aid Centres. She could not have undertaken that case on her own. So that's how far they reach. So, without further ado, I am going to hand you over to Larry and Marion, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
I want to thank Katrina very much for that nice introduction. I don't really recognize the guy that she's talking about, but I thank her very, very much for that. I think everyone probably recognizes Marion McKeone for her substantial contributions on a regular basis across multiple media channels for giving us a sense of what it's like in the United States, not just during Donald Trump's presidency, but before then. And we're going to explore a lot of those themes for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to allow you to ask any questions that you might have for Marion. So I'm hopeful, and I think this will be a fascinating discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. Before we delve into the depths of it, I always think it's really important for an audience to know who you're hearing from. So Marion McKeone, Irish woman in the United States for a long time. Where are you from?
I'm from Dublin originally, Larry, and I've been in the States, I suppose, on and off for about 20 years. The first election I covered there was the 2000 election, which was a real baptism of fire, because that was the election, I'm not sure if you remember, where nobody knew who won, and you had the hanging chads, and it was George W. Bush and Al Gore, and we went straight into that, and it was very memorable. For many reasons.
And you're also, sorry about this now, guys, you're also a lawyer,
That's right.
and you turned your trade to journalism as well. How did that happen?
Do you know, there was no big plan. I studied law in Dublin and at the King's Inns, and I did practice as a barrister for a couple of years, but I always found the sort of the foreign correspondent aspect and the travel and the different cultures in different countries very, very interesting. So that was where I ended up.
Now, the theme of much of these talks is about borders and things that happen on the border. And obviously we've all seen and read things about what has happened on the border between the United States and Mexico. Marion has spent a significant amount of time on the border, and I'm just wondering if you can bring some of that to life maybe for people here, beyond what they see, beyond what they read. What is a typical day on the border like? What are the kind of things that you've seen?
Okay, so I think that the first thing is you have to, the length of the border, because the one thing that I never really understood until I got to the States was the vastness. So the border is 2,000 miles long. So, you just imagine that, and it's little crooks, and, part of it is separated by river, part of it's desert, part of it's mountain, and part of it is very busy, thriving border towns. I would say that what we see at the moment, and what has been really distressing, and what I've seen in Calexico, which is a town just in California, and what I've seen in several towns in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, is a situation at the moment that is completely out of control. You have thousands of people trying to cross the border. Most of these people are not from Mexico, which they used to be historically. In fact, the number of Mexican immigrants coming across is at a very, very low level. These are people that are coming from what's called the Northern Triangle. These are countries, it's El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And the reason that they're leaving primarily is they're fleeing all kinds of violence and poverty in their own countries. They're fleeing very corrupt governments who are basically turning a blind eye to vigilante gangs who are going around and beating up political opponents, killing them, extorting them for money. And then there are also drug gangs, drug cartels. And one of the real things that hasn't got a lot of attention is the effect that climate change has had in the Northern Triangle, as it has everywhere in the world. A number of the people who I spoke to, especially indigenous tribes, who had fled, they said they couldn't grow anything anymore because the climate that they were used to and the crops that they grew, the topsoil was gone, all kinds of things had happened that they just could not grow the crops they used to grow, and their families were literally starving. There was nothing else. These were subsistence farmers, and I've seen this in Africa as well. If you can't grow the subsistence crops or graze the few animals that you have, your family starves. There's no other income. So this is the level of desperation that we're seeing of people who are either, and there was a marvellous woman I met in McAllen who runs, her sister Norma Pima, and she runs a sort of an emergency respite centre where after you've crossed the border, you can go there, and you may have been these mothers and children may have been in the desert for weeks and weeks, and they haven't eaten properly. The children tend to be very sick. They've picked up all kinds of things from like impetigo, it's like a skin bacteria, to bronchial infections, to flus, pneumonia, insect bites that have got infected, and they're brought to this place and they can get a hot meal, they can get a shower, they'll get new clothes because their clothes are literally in rags. Like the children are coming in, their feet are swollen from walking in their bare feet because the little flip-flops they had are long since, you're talking like walking hundreds of miles in really horrible conditions. So this is what you see, and their arrival then is met with such fear. Now I will say that on the border towns, by and large, the Americans are very sympathetic. The Americans who live in border towns, in Calexico, in McAllen, in Brownsville, in San Isidro, they're all very sympathetic because these people tend to not, for starters, stay in the border towns, but they do come there and they will then normally go on, get on a bus or whatever, and go to where they may have relatives or friends or contacts. But they see that these people are not violent criminals. You know, they're just not. That they're, at the moment, it's a lot of women with young children, it's families, it's people who are, and Sister Norma, who I mentioned, said to me directly, she said, you imagine that you're in a burning building. She said, you are going to jump out of that building with your children, even if you think you're going to break your leg in the fall, because it's the best chance you have. So for them, currently, America, even with all the hostility, even with all the dangers of crossing, even though they know that they may well be kept in these awful detention centres, they may be separated from their children and they may be sent back to them, it's still the best chance they have.
There's a lot to unpick, I think, from the comments that you've made. Maybe if I could just push a little bit on something. Mm-hmm. It is a very difficult situation. I don't think anyone in the United States is saying that there can be an open border. No. Where do you think the solution lies, or what do you think could make the way towards a more humane system or a more humane pathway for these people?
Right. I think, and you know, this is because nobody is offering solutions in America at the moment. And, you know, Democrats are equally at fault here. They're ducking the real hard issues, just as Republicans are. And both parties have their reason for doing so. So you've got to figure that, for starters, there are 11 to 12 million undocumented workers in America. Now, the American economy cannot survive without these workers. So they need to stop kidding themselves. And they need to, you know, people are saying, oh, you can't reward criminal behavior, etc. Some of these people have been living there for 20, 30 years. They have families, they have American children. So you need to regularize that. You know, and both parties need to just bite the bullet there and acknowledge that the American, I've been in a place like North Dakota where they cannot get workers from anywhere. They're desperate for workers to come in from America, etc. So there needs to be a complete reform of the American system where I think you've got to make these people legal. You can find them, you can do whatever you want, you know what I mean? And then there has to be a clear path where you can say, okay, we will allow this many unskilled labourers a year, whether it's 100,000, 200,000, but crossing the border illegally is a crime. And, you know, in Ireland, we would regard that as a crime. We can't expect America to have an open border. But what's happening at the moment where people who are asylum seekers are being treated as criminals has to end. It has to end. These people are not criminals. They're asylum seekers. And the reason that they're entering illegally is because the system, and I've seen this on the bridges, there are pedestrian bridges, and I've seen it in Brownsville and I've seen it in other places, where people and, you know, mothers with small babies will be sitting on a soaking wet bridge for 3, 4, 5, 6 days with no food, no nothing, and they're terrified to even go and get water or whatever, because then they lose their place, you know, in this queue of hundreds and hundreds. And then the border people say we can only allow in so many a day. It's a thing that they call ticketing, essentially. And then so these people are left overnight and the queues build. So what these people do out of desperation is they will go somewhere else and cross over illegally, and they'll then present themselves to the Border Patrol people, to the Customs and Border Patrol, and then they're brought in and detained, and then all this other awful stuff kicks off. But so they need to actually have a system where asylum seekers, now you can make your asylum laws different, you can make it more efficient, you can deal with them more expeditiously, but they need to really just make the situation better for asylum seekers. They need to be allowed in, they need to be, in the Obama era, asylum seekers were, it's called catch and release, which I think is awful, but they were given an ankle bracelet or some kind of electronic monitoring, and they were released to sponsors or to homes. It turned out that I think it was between 85 and 94% turned up for their court dates. So when Donald Trump and Republicans like Stephen Miller say, oh, they disappear, you never see them again, it's just not true. And I think one of the things at the moment that we have to separate fact from propaganda and fact from ginning people up and making people angry so that they're not listening to the facts. And the fact is that most of these people do turn up. Now, only about 20 to 25% will eventually be granted asylum. And these people then, if they are deported, then they do have to go back home, and it is awful. And this is where what America has to do, what America has always done, is you know, soft aid, like where you invest in the countries, you make it so that the people don't have to flee. And that means dealing with corrupt governments and governments like the president of, I think it's Honduras at the moment. He's very pro-Trump. He has good reason to be. And so you deal with these countries, and you say you cannot, you penalise them for corruption, but you help the aid people who are down there, who are helping to retrain people, who are helping families so that they're not starving, so that they're not desperate.
One of the things you touched upon there, Marion, we're talking about specifically in an American context at the moment, but this is a bigger, broader challenge. And one of the things that perhaps at times irks me as an American living in Ireland is that Europe hasn't come up with a satisfactory resolution to these issues either. And what we're seeing, broadly speaking, is migration from the global south, as it were, to the north. And I know that you've spent time in Africa as well as in the United States. If you could make some overarching comments about this migration and the challenges that it presents for, I suppose, the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think the first thing is that what we really need to recognise, and it's been shown throughout history with every migratory wave, is it's good for the economy. It's good. People are not coming here, are coming to America and taking your jobs, which is the big Trump myth. What happens when there's immigration is it's good. Every economy in the world benefits from immigration. So first of all, you need people to get rid of this fear thing of, we're going to be overrun by immigrants. It's just not true. But I think secondly, I worked on the Syrian conflict, and I spent a lot of time on the Syrian border with Lebanon and just inside of Syria as well in Wadi Khalid and up north near Homs. Now, Lebanon is a country that's about the size of Ireland. It's incredibly politically unstable. It's got about 24 different political parties who form these crazy coalitions, and the whole thing could go at any second almost. And it's also still recovering from a civil war that lasted for a quarter of a century and was really brutal. Having said that, Lebanon is also a very poor country. While I was there, the Lebanese government allowed in, I think it was 1.5 million Syrian refugees, 1.5 million into a tiny country with a population of 4 million. The sky didn't fall, there was no big catastrophe, and a lot of these Syrians have now assimilated, and there hasn't been, it has its problems. It would be naive and it would be dishonest to pretend it doesn't have its problems. There are huge problems in absorbing 50% of your population, a new population, in education, in even things like sanitation over a couple of year period. But they're doing it. So America could take a lot more people. Europe could take a lot more people. Angela Merkel allowed in 1 million immigrants and refugees. Germany's GDP has grown, 13% in the last couple of years. So immigrants are not the problem. The problem is fear. And the problem is fear of immigrants. And the problem is political parties and political individuals, and we know who they are in Europe and in America, who use this as a way to raise their own profile, to get support, and to tap into the most base and the most crude fears of the population. And they tend to say to working class people and to people who have not had college educations, they're going to take your jobs. So they want to make these people afraid, and they want to cause conflict at that level, because when refugees move into new countries, they tend to move into the areas and the neighbourhoods and to work at very low-paid jobs and to work at unskilled jobs. And so but America at the moment is chronically short of labour at all levels. So it's really, to me, the frustration is not dealing with the facts, that you have to deal with the facts.
You spoke there about fear, and I think that that's an important point, because in my view, anyway, fear and hope are the two most important emotions that politicians can appeal to, and the two most powerful emotions in electoral politics. We saw Barack Obama, who I think played to people's hopes. On the other hand, we saw Donald Trump, who played to people's fears. Now, I would say there are two fears: legitimate fears and illegitimate fears. And I think some of what Marion has said is about illegitimate fears. But there are legitimate fears. And I want to quote something about Donald Trump's appeal, if we can bring this back to the United States. A really insightful piece written by somebody who's not a Donald Trump supporter, but like me, has a lot of friends who are. And what he said, and he said, Donald Trump, people who voted for Donald Trump are our relatives, our friends, our neighbors. They are not haters. Some of the most decent, kind, unselfish people I know. And I don't think that gets enough play in the media, especially when we look at rallies like the ones that were held this week. And I'd like Marion to maybe expound a little bit about that. There are 60 million or more Americans who voted for Donald Trump. They did so for all sorts of reasons. I think Marion has great insights as to why they did.
Yeah, I think, and this was something that when you travel around on the campaign trail, you end up staying in all kinds of places. And all I can say is thank God for Airbnb, because a lot of places, not just because it's convenient, but because you stay with families. A lot of people will rent out rooms in all kinds of places, in really remote towns and cities. And it gives you a real insight when you're talking to them into what their concerns are, what their priorities are. And so many people, I remember, and they are the kindest. It's true, they're the kindest, friendliest, most generous people. And they really did feel shut out of America for a number of reasons. And it really goes back to the collapse in 2008, when so many people lost their jobs and they lost their homes. And there was one farmer in Nebraska who I remember meeting, and he had actually traveled down to the Trump, the election night when a lot of people got a big shock in New York. And I was at the Trump victory party, as he called it, and as it turned out, it was his victory party. And there was a man there from Nebraska who said to me that he had voted for Trump and that he really wanted him to win. And he said, the reason he voted for him was, and he said, I'm not a racist. He said, I'm really not. And a lot of people would say this, and it's true, they're not racist. And he said, but what I see is, he said, I'm scraping a living as a farmer. He said, but a lot of my friends who worked in the coal mines and worked in manufacturing, their jobs are gone. He said there were no jobs to replace them. When 2008 happened, they lost their houses as well. And he said they still have 4 children or 5 children, but they're now working in Home Depot, stocking shelves for $10 an hour. They have the same expenses, the same pressures, but their salaries are 30% what they used to be. And these people are desperate. There are 14 million people in America who live on or below the poverty line. I mean, not everybody in America is wealthy. Some people are desperately poor. They rely on minimum wage jobs and below minimum wage jobs. And these are the people who get forgotten. And these are the people who tend to be also, because they get forgotten, they're ripe for exploitation by people like Donald Trump, who will appeal to them and say, I'm the one who's going to sort you out. I'm the one who's going to increase your wages. I'm going to stop these immigrants from coming in and taking your jobs. Again, more myth. And they feel that, Barack Obama did a number of great things as president. He also made a number of mistakes, and some of his foreign policy, in particular with Syria, but I'm digressing. He focused a lot on rights, on intangibles, on the rights of gay people, on the rights of a number of groups, and this was all really necessary and really important. But if you're a father or mother of 3 or 4 kids and you're living on minimum wage and you're working 3 jobs, they see these issues as coastal issues, that these are the things that people in New York and California are very worried about. And they did believe that Barack Obama catered to those groups, but he wasn't worried about their wages. And people who lost their homes, and millions of Americans lost their homes back in 2008, 2009, 2010, they never got their homes back. They're never going to own a home again. They're going to live in substandard rental housing for the rest of their lives, probably. So you have to have sympathies for these people, because they really believed that things couldn't get worse with Donald Trump, and that he was the only one who seemed concerned about them. Now, as it's turned out in the last 3 years, Donald Trump has kept his promises to the evangelical groups. They've got their Supreme Court judges and they've got their conservative judges the whole way down. They're very happy. The wealthy and the corporations, he's kept their promises to them with the tax cuts. The only group that hasn't fared well is the very group that he promised. It's the group of poor, sort of unskilled workers in America who really needed help the most, and he's now, what he's giving to them instead is this sort of, oh well, let's scapegoat the immigrants, so we can all agree on that. And so this is when he does this stuff, like with the 4 congresswomen in the last week, or his baiting or his yelling about immigrants. He somehow believes that he's relating to them, and he's providing them with a scapegoat. And it's very sad to see that, because they're getting nothing else.
Maybe just a little bit of pushback on that.
Okay.
What I say to you, that perhaps he has delivered in a sense to those people, in that, one, he's avoided any military interventions in the past during his tenure, which would have disproportionately affected those people. And second, that obviously he's fighting against the tide. Globalization is overwhelming us all, but he is pushing hard to get American jobs, so-called, back to the United States. is he not making some progress in those two fronts?
Well, I think the progress that he's making can be measured by the fact that the coal miners' unions in the last couple of weeks have invited all of the Democratic candidates to come meet them to hear their proposals for retraining, because they're starting to realise that no, these mine jobs are gone. People, there are new forms of energy, and that coal mining is now obsolete. So what the Democrats had said all along, and what Hillary Clinton had said, but didn't communicate very well about retraining, is now of interest to them, because for people who are unskilled or who have worked in the mines for 10, 20 years, you've got to retrain, and you need to retrain to work in solar energy and green energy. And I think the Democrats have some very good plans on this and some good suggestions. So honestly, Larry, I would love to agree with you, but I think, no, he has done very little for these groups.
What about the point of military interventionism? I think we saw, for instance, very recently, people challenged Donald Trump that he said 10 minutes before there was going to be a military intervention, he pulled back. I think if we look at previous Republican presidential candidates, for instance, John McCain, who's an honorable and decent man, but very much a hawk in terms of America's military, doesn't Donald Trump deserve some credit, at least on that front, for saying we're not going to be the world's police force, we are going to retrench, and that hasn't that benefited the world in some sense anyway?
I just heard a no there. Okay. I'm seeing this as okay, I see the point you're making, but I think that if you look at 9/11, and that happened, and I was in New York when that happened, and George Bush initially said, okay, we're going to go after the Taliban in Afghanistan because they're basically facilitating Al-Qaeda. So that was a situation where something happened that America had to react to. Donald Trump, I think, is creating problems where they didn't exist previously. So he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which was an incredibly foolish thing to do. So what he tends to do is he creates a crisis, and then he goes, oh, look, I just solved it. But the crisis didn't happen until he created. So had he just stayed in the nuclear deal, it's not perfect. You see, no deal is perfect. It's never going to be, but it was the best that could be obtained at the time. So had he stayed within that, and the US had remained a signatory, you wouldn't have what's going on now. And then even with North Korea, that you have this thing where he's going on about Little Rocket Man and Fire and Fury, and then he pulls back, and suddenly they're in love, and it's all a reality show, but it's not making the world safer. It's fine for reality TV, but we live in the real world. It's not making the world safer. And also the alienating of US allies, the way he treated the British ambassador, that you treat your allies with such contempt while you cozy up to people like Putin, while you cozy up to Erdogan, while you cozy up to Duterte. It's very confusing, because the world needs some kind of certainty. You need to know whose side you're on. You need to know what principles you adhere to. And I see none of this happening. Now, the fact that there isn't a war, that he didn't arbitrarily, preemptively strike a country, I suppose we should be grateful for that. But
I was going to dig for some credit, but now I see where it is.
Sorry, Larry, you're not on this one. But I've no problem with talking to North Korea. I've no problem with talking to Iran. I think yes, it's far better to engage in dialogue than in armed conflict. But the way that he's doing this, where it's more attention-seeking and saber-rattling, and you lose credibility every time. And, I think at this stage we've no idea what his foreign policy is. He doesn't know what it is. And on the military thing, one of the groups of people I find very interesting to speak to is the US military, because a lot of the generals and advisors at very senior levels, they've seen war. They were involved in both Iraq wars. They know the cost to their soldiers and their troops, and they really do not have a high opinion of Donald Trump. They think that he disrespects the military. They think that his foreign policy, such as it is absolutely chaotic and dangerous, and it's the kind of thing that somebody will be goaded into a mistake. That with Iran, that it could be an unintentional, it could be this, like you're ginning it up and you go to brinkmanship and you're playing a kind of game of chicken, and that at some point somebody's going to go over the edge, and that's their fear. So I don't think they feel any gratitude or respect for Donald Trump and his foreign policy whatsoever that I've seen from speaking to them.
Okay, the one thing that's come to light, I think, especially this week, is one of the things Donald Trump used subtly and not at all subtly in terms of his electoral success has been race and the ever-fraught issue of race in the United States. Now, I don't think it's as simple to say that Donald Trump was elected because of race, or race is the key ingredient, but it certainly is one of those ingredients. And maybe you might talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that absolutely race. And I think we need to go back to Obama. You know, I remember Obama's inauguration day, and it was a freezing cold morning in Washington, and there were 2 million people there. And I've never been in a situation, I think it's one of the days in America I will always remember, where there are 2 million people, and the feeling of joy, and it was people of all races. And you really thought, my God, America has really become a post-race society, that it's become a society of just Americans. And the very uplifting speech and the very uplifting, you know, tone. And it became clear very quickly afterwards that no, people voted for Barack Obama because he was an extraordinarily gifted politician, because he was very smart, and because he offered hope, as you mentioned earlier, after a very dark era. You know, and you know, America financially had imploded. America internationally was involved in horrible wars that most people thought were wars of choice and were not necessary. So in that context, to have somebody who was, Americans love new. They really do. They love new. And we saw that even with Hillary Clinton. It seems to me that they will take a new, untested, but somebody who's bringing something new over experience and somebody they've seen around the houses for a long time, every time. So it turned out anyway that a lot of American people were furious that they had a black president. A lot of American people felt that this was something that should never have happened. And I do remember speaking to an FBI agent very soon after Barack Obama's election, and she had been involved in security in Washington, and she said to me, he's not my president. He'll never be my president. And this was an FBI agent who was a federal employee, but she spoke for a lot of other people who really believed that America should not have a black president. So it turned out America wasn't at the stage we thought it was at, that Barack Obama was almost, I think, an aberration. And America is still evolving, and it is improving, but no progress is linear, no progress is straight. It's always one step forward, a step back, or sideways. And I think Barack Obama said that himself. And I think then what happened was a lot of people felt that they really were angry that they had a black president, and then they came out and they were going to vote for Donald Trump. They were going to vote for somebody who was unabashedly a champion of white America, who unabashedly said, and there's this big fear in America that by 2040, I think it is, or 2050, that white America will be in the minority. It won't be the minority ethnic group, but there will be more other groups like Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans that combined will be a bigger number than white Americans. And this is a huge fear among white Americans. It really is. And I think that this shouldn't be understated. So yes, Donald Trump saw this. And because he is very skilled in certain ways, and he's a very skilled communicator, and he tapped into that fear. And when he came down those steps, the elevator or escalator in Trump Tower back in 2015, and started talking about Mexicans being rapists, and Mexicans being criminals, that was very, very deliberate. And, you know, it helped to single him out from the other pack of 17 Republican candidates, but also he was playing to a specific group of Americans whose attention he wanted. And when you saw him last week, and he's talking about Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Diana Presley, and the other women being told to send them home, you know, lock her up and send her back. There's very little difference in those two. The only common word there is her, that he feels that he can really pick on women, and pick on women who are, that, as he sees it, not American, because they're women of colour. And I think so. We see where his 2020 campaign is going, and it's not good.
Yeah. You know, and again, I think it's going to be more of the fear, and I think there's going to be an element of misogyny in all of that. Yeah. I just want to a quick question. Maybe sure. you can say this might have a one-word answer to it. Do you think, in a sense,
I hope so for the audience.
Do you think, in a sense, that Barack Obama was almost destined to fail? That is, that somebody who could lift a room and lift a country and almost lift a world with the rhetoric and with the speeches he made and the hopes and everything that he said, that he was never going to be able to live up to that promise?
You know, I think that after the inauguration day that I mentioned earlier, from there was no further up than that almost. Like, you know, that was really the zenith of a feeling and a moment in America of such, you know, euphoria, and such a feeling that America really had gone the distance. And that, but I think, no, he wasn't destined to fail. But I'll tell you what didn't help was, while the inauguration day was going on, Mitch McConnell and a group of Republicans met in the Ebbett Grill, which is a Washington restaurant, and they said that their mission was going to be to make sure that he failed, to make sure that he got no legislation through, and to make sure that he was a one-term president. Now, that is a horrible way for any opposition party. If the Democrats had done that to Donald Trump, and I think the Democrats have made a lot of mistakes in the last couple of years, it would be appalling. But I think that Barack Obama was against a Republican Party who were going to hobble him at every turn, and who did. And notwithstanding that, he did have achievements on climate change. He did have a lot of achievements. He did pull America out of the worst recession since the 1920s. He did a lot of things that I think were very extraordinary, but he also made mistakes. And I think that one of his mistakes was that he was a little too lofty at times. There were times he didn't communicate to America that the country had made progress. America now has had 121 months, I think, of uninterrupted economic growth. So since 2010, the economy has been growing. Donald Trump came in the first day, he was taking credit for it. You know, Barack Obama always had that sort of, that the Democrats aren't very good at communication in the way that Republicans are. And I think that he could have been certainly stronger in some areas, and I think he did make a big mistake in his keeping above the fray when he knew that Russia was meddling in the election. I think that he should have been much stronger there before the election took place.
We're going to get to election 2020 in a minute, because I know you're all curious about that. But I do want to ask a question about Donald Trump vis-a-vis the media. And there are three trends, or three strands of thinking, I suppose, when it comes to this. First is that Trump manipulates the media and has them all eating out of his hand and doing his bidding. Second is that Donald Trump is, at least his adherents would say, he can't get a fair break from the media. They're always portraying the negative, they're always downing him, etc. And the third, which I have to say is kind of my own, is this cynical thing that Donald Trump's the best thing that ever happened to the media. Comment on the three strands.
All three are true. Okay, how about that? I think, to take your point, Larry, the media, if you take even the print media and indeed CNN, MSNBC and Fox, before Donald Trump, their ratings, the print media, the New York Times, the Washington Post and the local media were in big trouble. They weren't selling nearly as many papers. Their online subscriptions were pretty dismal. So suddenly Donald Trump comes along and the media financially, economically starts doing much, much better. So I think on a crude level, yes, he has been very good for the media. And I think, I recall in 2016 where literally CNN, MSNBC and Fox, the technicians would just turn on whatever lights and sound was necessary, and they would have Trump unfiltered. Donald Trump got over almost $3 billion worth of free media during the election campaign, because everything he said was replayed and analysed and dissected. And Hillary Clinton, who is a dull campaigner, was barely getting media time because she wasn't creating controversy, and the media feeds on controversy. Donald Trump knew that straight away. If you throw a big bright shiny object over there, all the media are going to run after it, and that was what happened. Can he get a fair shake from the media? I think Donald Trump believes that any publicity is good publicity. And as I think it was P.T. Barnum said, once you spell my name right, I don't care what you write. And I think he really does get that he also has fiercely loyal media. Breitbart, he has, there are a number of media groups in America that are buying up a lot of local media that are very, very pro-Trump and very, very right-wing. So he has that. He has also Fox News, which despite their lover spats, is still very much his mouthpiece. And it really is the White House's broadcast station now. So I think that, I do think that what he would call the liberal media, or the mainstream media, goes after every little thing that Donald Trump does. And I think we all need to have more perspective. And what happens is, with Donald Trump, scandal is a volume business, and controversy is a volume business, and insulting people is a volume business. So he will do 10 a day, and one will eclipse another and another and another, and you can't keep up, and people get exhausted. So I think that, the liberal, as he would call it, but the mainstream media who rely on fact should focus more on the big themes and not run after every little squabble that he creates. I think they're doing him a favour there and doing themselves a disservice.
We live in, I think, extraordinary times.
Yeah.
And whatever your characterization of Donald Trump, I think the word extraordinary, whether it's negative or positive, has to apply to him. He's an extraordinary figure.
Yeah.
In that vein, let's talk about election 2020. And what are the Democrats going to do, and how do you see this unfolding?
I hate to be the bearer of possibly grim news, but I think Donald Trump's in a very strong position at the moment. I think he could easily win in 2020. And the reason I'm saying this is that recently speaking to a lot of people, Americans who were not necessarily Trump supporters and are certainly not racist and don't like his racist agenda, have said to me directly, look, the stock market this year alone has increased 20%. That they're looking at their bank balance, and you know, it's always the economy, stupid. Ideals and idealism, things like, you know, abhorring racism and wanting fair play and wanting a better deal for immigrants and not wanting people to be treated the way that I've seen them treated on the border. People will look at that, and then they look at their bank balance, and then they look at their paycheck, and they think, yes, I despise what Donald Trump is doing on race, I despise what he's doing on the border, but my stock market balance has increased, has doubled. My 401k, which is their retirement funds, are going through the ceiling, and my wages have increased. And also, if you're wealthy, you're paying much less tax. So I think a lot of people, you know, I remember a guy in, I think it was in Pennsylvania, he said to me back in 2016, he said, you know, saying that you vote for Donald Trump is like saying you watch porn. Nobody will admit to it, but a lot of people do it. and it was, you know, and I think it's true, a lot of people would say, oh no, I'll never vote for Donald Trump, but yet he got 60 million votes. And I think that this time around, because the economy is still doing well, nobody can predict anything in American politics. A year, in fact, 15, 16 months is a long time. Anything could happen between now and November 2020. One of the things I'm watching is the Jeffrey Epstein thing, because that's, I'm sure you're all familiar, that is something which, and I'm not saying it's going to implicate Donald Trump, but that is something which, again, things come out of nowhere. And I think it was Bertie Ahern who said it's the little things, and it can really be the little things that can really just spin out of control. But at the moment, Democrats are squabbling among themselves. I think that Nancy Pelosi, who is very smart in some ways, I think she's mishandled the whole investigation impeachment thing. And I think people are just muddled now, and there are 6 different investigations going on. Donald Trump is railroading every one of them. And, you know, they're not getting, they're all almost eclipsing each other. I'm not saying that she should have allowed a vote for impeachment, but what I'm saying is that almost in a way, you've got to clear something, and you've got to be clear about how you're doing it. And there's one thing Americans really like, and it's decisiveness. And they would rather somebody be wrong, I think, but be decisive, than have people meandering and you're trying to please every constituency. Also, the Democratic field at the moment is not that strong. You've got 24 different people. I don't think Joe Biden, despite the fact that he is popular, I think, and he's a really decent man. I've met him many times.
Can I interrupt you there for a second?
Sure.
What I think Democrats are really struggling with, and I think I have a lot of sympathy for them in this regard, is this landscape that they're dealing with and this unprecedented president. And they're grappling with 2 different notions. Electability, that is the person who might please the most amount of people, versus excitability, that is the person who might hold the Barack Obama key, the person who can get young people, people of color, et cetera, to turn out and overwhelm all the political trends that we those of us who like to think we know something, go by. Those are the 2 things that they are dealing with. Which one do you think is going to win out?
Well, you know, it's going to have to be electability, because they haven't got the excitability factor.
And you think Biden is not the guy?
No. You know, I think with Joe Biden that the more you see of him, really, the more you see of him, the less impressive he becomes. And it's a weird thing, because Donald Trump is 73, 74. He is a very young 73, 74. You know, that campaign trail, let me tell you, like at the end of 2016, I was exhausted. Honestly, it is, you go to every little town, your diet is appalling, your state. Now, okay, he has his private jet, and he's not doing it like we were doing it.
And his KFC.
But indeed, it's, you know, he's a good ad for KFC, I'll tell you. But, you know, his energy is really, you know, I saw Bernie Sanders by the end of the primary. He was really, I think, exhausted mentally and physically. Hillary Clinton, who is a formidable and very tough woman, it really took a toll on her as well. Only Donald Trump seemed more energized by the end than by the beginning. And I think that in a race that would be a Biden-Trump matchup, I think that Trump does have more of the excitability factor for his base. I don't think Biden has that. I think Kamala Harris, you know, her launch happened in January this year, and it was so professional and so well done, and 20,000 people turned out. Now, a lot of presidential candidates would kill for that number at the end of a presidential campaign, never mind, you know, at the launch for a primary. But I think that she is too cautious, and unless she changes, you don't win votes by saying, let's have a conversation about that. So when she's been asked about contentious issues, she says, well, it certainly deserves a conversation. No one's going to vote for somebody who says about something controversial, it deserves a conversation. You've got to have the courage of your convictions. You've got to propose bold new solutions. Beto O'Rourke, and I think we spoke about this, who was regarded as the great new thing of the Democratic Party. I was down in Texas covering his Senate race, and there was one huge event, and Willie Nelson was playing. I was talking to a lot of people, and they all said, well, I'm here to see Willie Nelson. So I thought, aha. And it's like, Bruce Springsteen used to play for the Democratic candidates. He played for John Kerry. 80,000 people turned up. They're all there to see Bruce Springsteen. And I think Democrats can confuse these things, and they put a lot of money into the bells and whistles of campaigning, but you've got to have the ideas, and you've got to have the convictions, and you've got to have the excitability. As I say, I think Pete Buttigieg is enormously talented, and I think what he has done, which is to take back religion from the right, and this was something I've seen traveling all over America. Religion doesn't belong to the right wing and to the Republicans. Democrats, moderates, independents are just as religious. And I think what Pete Buttigieg is doing, even though he doesn't have a chance of winning, and he probably shouldn't, because being president shouldn't be an entry-level job. It shouldn't be your first job in politics. It was Donald Trump's first job in politics, and we're seeing the result. It shouldn't be. But I think that he's a really talented candidate. I think he'd be an asset to any Democratic administration, but also to take back religion and to say, no, Mike Pence, you don't own religion, and no right, to the right wing, that Democrats are just as religious. I think that's a bold move, and we need to see more boldness from the Democrats.
If I were to practice my Second Amendment right and hold a gun to your head, would you say Donald Trump will be reelected?
I think there's a good chance. I think there's a very good chance. And as I said, with the caveat that if there's one thing we've learned about American politics, it's that anything can happen. We saw that with Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor of California, with Jesse Ventura, a wrestler becoming governor of Minnesota. Even with Barack Obama, who was a 42-year-old with almost no political experience, getting elected after the sort of white triumphalism of Bush and Cheney. And I think we discussed this. So far, I think Donald Trump has not done the damage to America in quantifiable terms that Bush and Cheney did. That administration was in so many ways so toxic, but I think what Donald Trump has done, where he's done damage, is to the fabric of America, that he has ripped, it was always divided, but he has really ripped those divisions further apart. He panders to America's worst instincts. The racism, the unabashed, like Charlottesville, the way that he refuses to be the bigger person, the way that he refuses to be an example, a moral example, which is what American presidents, to varying degrees, have always, none of them are perfect, and they've all made mistakes. Bill Clinton had his scandals. They all, I think Barack Obama was the only president I can remember who went 8 years without a scandal. And now we're getting all those scandals that were stored up in the ether. We're getting them all now. They're all coming out. So I think that Donald Trump, having said, notwithstanding all of the shortcomings and all the controversies, he's in a very strong position. You don't have to hold a gun to my head. It's okay.
Okay, on that perhaps glum note, I want to ask you one last question, because we've discussed this before. Mm-hmm. And if I can associate you with the...
Larry, we need to move to Q&A as soon as we can.
Okay.
The voice from the back.
Okay. Okay. Just very quickly.
Sure.
You're still optimistic about America?
Oh yeah. It's a wonderful country, and no country... I remember the second term that Bush and Cheney were elected in 2004. And it was after so many scandals in Abu Ghraib and Iraq. And the country, and then after the financial meltdown, the country then turned around and elected a young, idealistic, moral leader and repaired itself really quickly. So I would predict that after Donald Trump, you will have a woman president, not because you should have a woman president unless they're a very capable, skilled person, but because people are tired of this misogyny, they're tired of the ugliness, they're tired of the brutality. And I think if Kamala Harris in particular can get her act together, she could be a strong candidate. But America will recover, and it will repair. It always does.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Q&A. I think we can probably just take 3 of them, and I see 1, 2, is there one more hand?
I see one down the back there.
Is there 3 hands? If there's 3 hands, we'll take 3 at a time, and we'll finish it up there. So go for it, yeah.
Hi, Marion.
Hello there, how are you?
I want to ask you just to follow on from your comment there that the Democrats should be brave and presumably in offering an alternative. I'm curious that you touched on, you said they must be brave and say not the Republicans only own religion and we should. What about being brave in other ways? And I asked that in the context of the spat between Nancy Pelosi and AOC, where Pelosi was described as part of the problem. Maureen Dowd criticised her heavily for that comment. But do you think she has a point? Isn't it time for the Democrats to actually, as Bernie Sanders did, embrace the word socialism? And with the Bernie Sanders brigade and the younger, foursome coming up, including AOC, isn't it time for them to offer a real, genuine alternative?
I think that you're right in several respects there, but I think that Americans, you can't underestimate the dread Americans have of the word socialism. Now, it might be attractive to about 30% of the electorate who are young, who want to see change, who are idealistic, to the sort of people who voted for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders' huge following. Young Americans really want to see changes in healthcare. They want to see changes in education. The cost of going to college, in particular in America, is enormous. But most Americans who are doing very well at the moment, because the economy in America is doing very well, when they hear socialism, they think somebody's going to come in and take all their money, and as they see it, give it to people who don't deserve it, who can't be bothered getting jobs. And it's a really big fear. And I think Pelosi, who's very experienced, I don't think she's handling the Ocasio-Cortez situation. It should be a big tent. You should have room for everyone. And I think that they should be focusing on things like the Green Deal, which can be exciting and innovative. I also think the Democrats need to get bold on immigration. They need to offer a real fix and stop running away from the problem. And they need to stand up to Trump in a more cohesive way. But I'm not sure that embracing socialism will get them anywhere. I think that will make 65% of Americans run the other direction, because it is a country that is really, really, the fear of what they see as socialism is very deeply ingrained.
Okay, second question I saw over here.
I don't actually call the US president by name. I call him Donny from Queens. It suits me. He's a highly dangerous individual. There are three scenarios at the moment. There's a British registered tanker in Bandar Abbas, Iran, because of the president. Another scenario, Kim Il-jung has never given any concessions about nuclear weapons, full stop, despite their love-in. And then the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, there are contentions there. US naval vessel and the People's Chinese Army Navy could be in conflict. Finally, the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, was coming up for review shortly. The President of the United States will refuse to entertain that treaty. We are all at risk. There is no doubt about that. Final word.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that you touched on there when it comes to nuclear arms is the treaty that was negotiated between Obama and Medvedev back in, I think it was 2008. That will expire in 19 months' time. Now, if that is not renegotiated or extended, that is extremely dangerous. So far, Donald Trump and John Bolton, who is a very dangerous individual to have as a national security advisor, are showing no inclination to extend that. And that is deeply worrying. Absolutely agree with you on China. Donald Trump's foreign policy is completely reckless. And as you said, and it is important to raise that point about North Korea, they have not given an inch on nuclear. America has conceded every inch of the way there with making Kim Jong-un, giving him the status of a statesman, bringing him on the world stage, the shakes, the hugs, the love letters, the whole thing. But in the middle of all this, North Korea has given nothing. Now, Donald Trump says America was poised to go to war with North Korea before he became president. That's not true. So again, it's using myth to justify a very reckless foreign policy that, as you say, is deeply worrying.
Okay. I see one more question. Yep. Last question here.
In your title, you have a question. A symptom of a greater US sickness? Now that's singular, a greater US sickness. Could you perhaps answer the question, is this a symptom of a greater sickness, in the sense of taking a step backwards from all the multiple problems which you've addressed so well, to answer that general one? Is the wall a symptom of one greater US sickness that we can describe?
I think that's a really good question, and I'm thinking as I'm speaking. I think that there is a malaise in America at the moment. I think there is an anger and a fear and a resentment towards immigrants that has largely been stoked up by Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is a symptom of the illness. And I think it's, America had all of these problems before Donald Trump came along. What he did was he made it safe for racists to come out and to say and do deplorable things. Charlottesville being the obvious example. He's made it safe for people to demonize immigrants, to scapegoat them. And, we spoke, there was one thing that to me really, and I still remember being on the border in one of the places where women and children were brought after they crossed the border first. And there was a woman with a 10-month-old baby. She was probably about 22 herself. And it was just after all the separations with the children who were being put in cages and all that. And immigrants were terrified. And a social worker, a volunteer, tried to help her to take the baby, to wash the child who had skin disease and all kinds of things. And the mother screamed in terror because she was sure that saying the baby was being taken to be bathed was a guise to take her baby from her and that she'd never see her again. And I still hear those screams of terror from that woman and that baby. And that people could come into America with that kind of fear, like a woman who was an asylum seeker who was fleeing a terrible situation it was Nicaragua she was from. That kind of dread, that to come to a country that was traditionally seen as a country that would welcome refugees, that would welcome asylum seekers, that would welcome people looking for a better life, to see that fear, and as I said, to hear it and to see it on her face as she held on to her baby and refused to let it go, even to be washed, to me is just, there is a greater malaise in America at the moment, and as I said, Donald Trump has exploited it. He has become president as a result of it. He did not cause it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Marion McKeone.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Larry. Thank you.